Hi Founder fans, Jason here, and welcome to our new series on the delegates to the First Continental Congress. And today we're going to be starting, much as the American founders would have, with New Hampshire. Of all the complicated things that happened in the First and Second Continental Congresses, the one thing they seem to agree on pretty quickly is, when we vote, let's start in the north and trellis our way down south. And we're going to copy them and do the same today and start with New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire only sends 2 delegates to the First Continental Congress. Next to me, you can see their names, John Folsom and John Sullivan. We will be dealing with a lot of Johns throughout this series. And even today, we're going to talk about at least 3, if not 4 of them. But anyway, before we talk about the Johns over here, we should really talk about the situation that New Hampshire found itself leading up to the First Continental Congress. So the First Continental Congress, before it's even called out, the different colonies create committees of correspondence to talk to each other. And back in May of 1783, at the urging of several other colonies, including Virginia's House of Burgesses, New Hampshire decides to create its own committee of correspondence. And, well, there's a royal governor named John Wentworth, who was actually a good friend of John Sullivan's for quite a long time, but John Wentworth decides to eliminate the New Hampshire Colonial Assembly in an attempt to stop the Committee of Correspondence from being formed. So just a day after they decide to create the Committee of Correspondence, the Colonial Assembly is disintegrated. Now, the Committee of Correspondence had been created, and it does act fairly covertly for about the next year. However, in the following April of 1774, just as things are starting to heat up a little bit, John Wentworth calls the Colonial Assembly back into service. There really needs to be a government, and he knows that, and he doesn't want there to be no government, and he certainly doesn't want to be a dictator. As I said, he was friends with not only John Sullivan, but most of the colonial leaders of New Hampshire, and he didn't want to make them mad, not out of fear necessarily, but just because he lived there too, and he wanted things to go smoothly. Now, they are called into session. Unfortunately, this is following the Boston Tea Party. About a month after called back into session in May of 1774 now, well, they get word of the Massachusetts Government Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, which essentially dissolves the Massachusetts government, and this is another thing that scares the people of New Hampshire. I'll remind you, at this point, New Hampshire today is between Massachusetts and Maine, and back then, Maine was also part of Massachusetts, so New Hampshire is very closely aligned with Massachusetts in many ways at this point. So this is the situation that New Hampshire finds itself in when the word goes out to call together the First Continental Congress. So they call a committee together in Exeter, New Hampshire, and this committee is the first provincial assembly, which essentially is a shadow government of delegates that come together without permission of King or Parliament or even Governor John Wentworth. Now, this committee gets together and they decide to elect 2 people to go to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to attend the First Continental Congress, what they then were calling the Continental Congress, because they didn't know there'd be any more. So that brings us to John Folsom and John Sullivan. Why these 2 people? Well, we'll start with Folsom. Folsom himself was from Exeter, New Hampshire, and he operated not only a merchant firm, but a merchant firm that specialized in lumber. Of all the products that the colonies were exporting, really the main one coming out of New Hampshire was lumber. So not only was Folsom exporting lumber, but he was also owned a sawmill. And actually, I'll remind you, one of the main complaints from New Hampshire itself at the time was, well, they had all these forests and all these trees, but the king would send his men out into the forest to put a stamp on the very best trees. They were to be reserved for the king, and they would go onto private people's lands, like, I don't know, John Folsom and some of his friends, and stamp the best trees that would make the best ship masts. Because lumber can be used for a lot of things, but the tallest, sturdiest trees, you'd want those to be the tall, sturdiest mast on the ships of His Majesty's Royal Navy, of course. So this actually broke out into violence on multiple occasions between the king's men and the colonists. And John Folsom, not only, since he was in the center of the lumbering industry and one of the people with one of the wealthiest lumber trading firms, He also was very closely associated with the Gilman family. Now, the Gilman family was one of the leading families of New Hampshire. They had been there. They, along with Folsom's ancestors, had founded the city of Exeter in the first place. Although calling it a city now is definitely a stretch, and even back then was still kind of a stretch, but it was a big town, big enough to be the place that the Provincial Congress of New Hampshire was meeting. Now, being involved in one of the leading industries of New Hampshire, being an associate of one of the leading families of New Hampshire, being one of the leaders of Exeter, and having his merchant firm operate out of Portsmouth, the leading port of New Hampshire, made Folsom a great candidate for this position, and he was sent to the First Continental Congress for all of these reasons. Now, we also have John Sullivan here. John Sullivan himself had also established a reasonably large trading firm out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, although Sullivan actually represented Durham, which was right across the bay, an interior bay called Great Bay. I should have put up a map probably of New Hampshire, but across the Great Bay on the interior is Durham, New Hampshire. And between Durham, Portsmouth, and Exeter, these towns or cities, whatever you might call them, are about 13 to 17 miles away from each other. Google Maps would not let me look how long a horse would take to ride between the two or the three, but on a bicycle, it would be about an hour and a half. So that puts a little bit of perspective onto where these three main towns of New Hampshire are located. Now, Sullivan, as a resident of Durham and someone who operated also a business out of Portsmouth, again, made him a leading candidate as a representative of all of New Hampshire, not just this part of New Hampshire. Sullivan, as I had mentioned, had also been very friendly for many years with Governor John Wentworth, although as things got hostile, they definitely distanced themselves from each other. But he was already taking up many positions. He had already served in the local militia, which gave him an added bonus. And these two went to the First Continental Congress and would be there the whole time. They both signed the Continental Association as well as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which they were sent by the First Continental Congress over to England to tell everyone what they were thinking, as well as to initiate a boycott the following December 1st, 1774, if their grievances had not been met. With that, these two returned back to New Hampshire. Now, I'm not going to go into their entire lives. I will note John Sullivan becomes very famous as one of the major generals in the Continental Army. He leads the famous Sullivan-Clinton campaign across upstate New York against the Iroquois Native Americans, and he would later be a governor of Massachusetts. As for Folsom, he's much less well-known, but he does participate across the board in a wide variety of positions in New Hampshire. He actually is in charge of the New Hampshire militia after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. He is appointed by New Hampshire to take over all militia units for New Hampshire that are outside of New Hampshire. This causes a little bit of conflict between him and General John Stark, who the colony of Massachusetts appointed someone else, future Brigadier General John Stark, to take care of all the New Hampshire militiamen within Massachusetts. So there's a little bit of confusion there. That gets resolved when the Continental Congress, a few years later, ends up appointing John Sullivan as a major general in charge of New Hampshire's militia and then Continental Army lines. So that's how that gets resolved. Now, there is one little more tidbit I'd like to add about these two particular founders. So the First Continental Congress is from early September till late October 1774, and they return to New Hampshire, or all the delegates return to their home colonies. Now, these two return to New Hampshire, and that's when Paul Revere shows up. Paul Revere does a lot of rides, and famously, Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere went on a ride mostly to warn everyone that the British were coming for gunpowder and other armaments that the militias held so they couldn't rebel. But Lexington and Concord was not the first time Paul Revere rode with this exact message. He did it on several occasions, one of which was in December of 1774 when he rode to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to warn everyone of what is called the Portsmouth Alarm, but generally they were called powder alarms. He was saying, hey, the British are coming. So the thing is, they were coming to Fort William and Mary just across the water from Portsmouth. Fortunately, when both Folsom and Sullivan were in the Provincial Congress the year beforehand, they had only allocated funds for one officer and 5 soldiers to guard that fort. So when word comes that the British are coming to take this, well, another John, our fourth John today, John Langdon, who himself becomes an important founder, he leads men across the water to storm the gates, so to speak, and take the powder and everything for the New Hampshire militia. Now, there were actually cannons fired by the people in the fort, and they violently tried to defend themselves. Fortunately, although there were injuries, no one was killed, and the men in the fort were just doing their job, and everyone realized that, so they were only held prisoner for a couple of hours. But John Langdon removes, in this raid, a bunch of gunpowder. The next day, however, well, there are still cannons in there, and we want those cannons. Now, John Sullivan, who by this point was at his home in Durham and missed all the fun, the very next day got his own militia and went back to the fort, which was now essentially empty, and took out all the cannons and heavy armaments. Furthermore, the British arrived later that day, but they wanted to get all of this stuff, all these goodies that they had just secured from the British in case they need a war. They wanted to move it further inland and harder for the British to get, because when the British are on their ships, it was easier for them to take than to actually go inland, because it would have made the people angry. And at this point, throughout most of the war, the British were really trying to keep the colonists on their sides as best they could. They weren't good at it, but they were trying their best. Now, why is this important that they're bringing these armaments that John Langdon and John Sullivan had secured from Fort William and Mary? Well, John Folsom shows up as the man who is really in charge of the militia at this point, and he takes that further inland and escorts them inland. And this would be really important because just, December, January, February, March, April, 5 months later, the Battle of Lexington and Concord breaks out. And New Hampshire sends a bunch of militia down to help. And what does that militia use to secure Boston and keep them locked in? Well, they have powder that they had taken under the guise of, under the guidance of John Folsom, John Sullivan, and John Langdon when they first stormed William and Mary. So that's a little, it's about 2 months after they get back, about a month and a half after they get back from the First Continental Congress. These men are involved in a very important battle. It's not really considered a battle of the Revolutionary War, but really one of the earliest battles of the Revolutionary War that does play a role in Lexington and Concord, and not long after that, the Battle of Bunker Hill. So that's a brief overview of the early careers of John Folsom and John Sullivan, New Hampshire's delegates to the First Continental Congress. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, hit like, make sure you subscribe for American Revolution 5 days a week, and leave me a comment. I plan on going through all of the different colonies, so if there's a particular delegate you'd like me to focus on during my jaunt through the First Continental Congress, please feel free to let me know, and I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow.